Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On the agenda tonight, we're going back to 1965. We're going to be taking a look at the Kinks and they're going to be playing through all day and all of the night. And before we get started, just to let you know, the audio quality isn't great on this and it's only 2 minutes and 16 in length. So we'll watch it all the way through and then we'll get into the analysis afterwards. But let's get these guys up on screen and see how they get on. Kinks! And there we have it, just before the statutory 60s bow at the end of the performance. But these guys, again, another band of that 60s generation where vocals were so important, and even with a band that had the edge that these guys did have, and it was so much of a departure from other bands around at the time. And I'm talking about bands like the Beatles and the Hollies, and those guys that had a really polished sound. And then the Kinks come along and throw everything out the window in terms of the polished sound. They've got a real edge to them. But most importantly, they haven't forgotten what makes a great song and how to write a great song. And these guys had so many great songs that involved harmonies, but pitch-wise, just leading up, we've got the verse, and then we get into that pre-chorus, and then we go up again into the chorus. It's just building the tension, and then the release in the chorus. It just takes you on that journey. So bands like the Kinks, the Kinks were one of the first bands really to introduce that heavier sound, that attitude, and the hard rock kind of sound, and really bass songs around guitar riffs, and make those riffs sound nasty with the tone. And the Kinks managed to make that all happen whilst keeping an eye on melody and composition and having something that's catchy and having a song that can connect to an audience, not only on a personal level but a musical level as well, because there were plenty of young kids and teenagers who wanted to rebel against their parents' style of music, and the Kinks gave them that option, but it was still good music. It was still strong melodically. It still had great songwriting within it. And something that I mentioned about videos from this time is how clean the tones are. And by nowadays standards, this is still really clean, but at the time, this was an edgy sound. It had a little bit of crunch, almost distortion in there, which really filled out the riffs and made their songs sound different to a lot of other bands, because a lot of other bands were just playing chords and it was mainly the focus on that melody of the lead vocalist, whereas here we had a lot of focus on guitar and driving riffs that are going on with the rhythm work that Dave Davies is playing here. He's also playing lead, and as to how he got that sound, I've seen it written that he took a blade to the cone of his amp and that's how he got that slightly distorted sound. But I've also seen an interview where he said he didn't do that, he just turned it up to 10 and used a cheap mic to record it. And around this time you had bands that would give you a really polished live performance, but also bands that were rough around the edges and would give you a bit more of a show and a bit more attitude. But the one thing that all the bands had in common was great songwriting. No matter how much attitude they had in their sound or how edgy they were or how polished they were, the songs were so strong. They had a hook in there, they had a great chorus, they had something that a crowd could sing back straight away, and that is the most important thing. And it'll be the case for the rest of time. You just have to look back. There have been so many bands that haven't been filled with top technical talent, but they have had hits, they have done really well because they have great songs. And the songs are what everything boils down to. And even the way that Ray delivers his vocal and his vocal sound in general, because it gives the music that edge, but also would have sounded a lot different to other bands around at the time. And it's interesting because when Ray and Dave first started, they auditioned singers, and one of those singers was Rod Stewart. And at the time, he was just a fellow pupil at the same school. But it didn't work out with Rod. Rod went off to start Rod Stewart and the Moonrakers, and it's interesting because they then became local rivals between Rod Stewart and the Moonrakers and Ray Davies Quartet. And just talking about the band name, because the Kinks was originally thought up in order to be a bit controversial, maybe to get them a bit of publicity through that means, because anything being related to kinky or kinkiness at the time was seen as borderline acceptable. Obviously, it was a totally different time, and nowadays it doesn't really have that effect so much, but around at the time, they thought it might be a good way to get some attention. And they went through a couple of managers, and the third manager that they hired was called Larry Page. And they auditioned for various record labels, but unfortunately got turned down. And then record producer Shel Talmy managed to get them a record deal at Pie Records. So the first single they released with Pie Records was their cover of Long Tall Sally. Unfortunately, that was largely ignored. So then they moved on to their second single, and that was You Still Want Me. And unfortunately, that failed to chart as well. So Pie Records said to the guys that if your third single isn't successful, then we're going to terminate the contract. And this is something that record labels can do. Apparently, just cancel a contract when they want to. So the third single that they then released was You Really Got Me. And the important thing to know about this is that originally it was recorded at Pie Records, and it was a lot slower and it didn't have the guitar sound that the band wanted, and they didn't want to release it like that. But the record label refused to allow the guys to re-record it in the studio and didn't put up any money for that. They just said it's not going to happen. So Shel Talmy, the guy that actually got them the record deal in the first place on Pie Records, he footed the bill for that recording session, and it just so happened it took them 2 takes. So You Really Got Me was released in August of 1964, and it went to number 1 in the UK, went to number 10 in the USA, and I guarantee you that the label still took their percentage, even though they denied them access to the studio to record it. But the next single, the 4th one on Pie Records, was this track, All Day and All of the Night. So this one went to number 2 in the UK and number 7 in the USA. So another massive hit, 2 hits back to back. And a lot of people will associate the Kinks with the British invasion in the 1960s, but the massive disadvantage they had is that from 1965 onwards, for 4 years, they were banned from entering the USA. And the official reason for this has never been stated, but a lot of people have cited the arguments within the band and the onstage fighting. When I mentioned about fighting on stage, there's one show in Wales where Ray said something to Mike Avery on drums, and Mike wasn't happy about this. I think Ray also kicked over the drum kit. So Mike picked up his hi-hat stand and hit Ray over the head with it, to the point where Ray was knocked out, he was unconscious, and Mike thought that he'd killed Ray. So Mike ran off, he fled the scene, and Ray had to go to hospital, have stitches in his head. He recovered, and when they were questioned about it afterwards by the police, they said that they were experimenting with throwing their instruments at each other. It was part of the live gig and part of the show, and they were just trying it at that gig. And this was all in 1965, so it probably didn't help their case trying to get into the USA, having this kind of reputation for live performances, but it by no means held them back in the UK, because they released Sunny Afternoon in 1966, and this removed the Beatles from the top spot because they were at number 1 with Paperback Writer, but then the Kinks overtook them and took that throne, and in 1967 they then released Waterloo Sunset, which went on to be a massive hit as well. And in 1970 they released Lola, which again was a massive hit, and an interesting story about that track is that when they went to perform it on the BBC, they weren't allowed to because it mentions Coca-Cola in the song, and the BBC have got very strict rules about saying brand names and promoting brands, so they weren't allowed to do that. And Ray went straight back into the studio and re-recorded the line Cherry Cola, so then he was allowed to perform on the BBC. And in 1971 they signed a 5-album deal with RCA Records, and they were also given a $1 million advance, so they put some of that money towards building their own recording studio, which they called Conk. So they continued to release albums throughout the 1970s, and in 1977 is when they released Sleepwalker, and that got to number 21 in the US charts. In 1978, they had one of their tracks covered by Van Halen, and that was You Really Got Me, so that helped to get them a little bit more publicity and exposure through that track, because that was a top 40 hit for Van Halen. In 1981, they released their album called Give the People What They Want, and that got to number 15 in the US charts. They also toured extensively at the beginning of the 80s. I don't want this video to go on for too long, but just a few things before I finish. They've sold over 50 million albums, and they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1990, and Brian May has credited the band with planting the seeds which grew into riff-based music. So they had such an impact on that hard rock sound that was to follow in the later years. But thank you so much for suggesting this video for me to take a look at, and keep those suggestions coming in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Rock!